Thanks everyone for joining us. Welcome to this Intellect Salon. If it's your first salon, feel like a restaurant server. It's your first time here, welcome. And if not, welcome back. Please, if you are new to Intellect, be sure to check out interintellect.com and see other salons that we have. And the things are available with membership. And we are really excited to have Professor Carissa Véliz with us today and to talk about this exciting new book that a lot of folks are talking about in many different corners on prophecy and on oracles and AI. I'll just as a very brief intro, Professor Veliz teaches at Oxford in the Faculty of Philosophy and is also part of the Institute for Ethics and AI. And she's written a book, Privacy is Power, which I think is very tied into this book, even though people may not expect, as well as working on authoring the ethics of privacy and surveillance and editing the Oxford Handbook of Digital Ethics. So I was joking a little bit before that this is a fascinating book of AI ethics that never mentions the phrase, which is probably a good thing given how it's become kind of polished by LinkedIn and what have you as a phrase. But we are really excited to talk about this. And I should say right off the bat, for those that don't know me, I should introduce myself. I'm Thomas Arnold. I'm a researcher at the Tufts Institute for AI and work on human and robot interaction and ethics and culture. So with that, I want to hand things over to my co-host to introduce himself and then get the questions started. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Thomas. Hey, everyone. And yeah, excited to chat with you, Professor Véliz. My name is Shreyas. I'm a former founder. I've built companies in the tech and blockchain space. And I have a blog called Dopamine Markets where I write about how increasingly more of our attention is being turned into markets and into things that people are betting on. And so yeah, the book was a really sort of fun way to engage with some of those ideas. Yeah, would love to kick it off. So maybe to start off, if you can just explain what the core premise of the book is and what your motivations were for writing it.
Yeah, thank you so much both for hosting the session and for having me. So the main premise of the book is that even though we tend to associate predictions with the realm of knowledge, we tend to think of them as something that is a kind of a quest for knowledge or a hypothesis or a glimpse of knowledge of the future. Actually, when you look at how predictions are used in the public sphere, and in particular predictions that have to do with the social world, more often than not, you realize that these are power plays in disguise. Very often, the people who use them very consciously as a kind of power play. But sometimes, even when people don't intend to use them as a power play, prophecies about people have these magnetism to themselves. They tend to bend reality towards themselves in a way that creates power currents, even when there's no intention behind them. And the motivation for writing the book was, it was so many things kind of coming together. But one thing was frustration at the public debates on AI ethics online, and I experience this on a daily basis. Every day, some famous, usually guy, will say something about AI, often outrageous, sometimes even sensible, but often outrageous. And then journalists and policymakers and everyone else will ask academics like me, oh, what do you think about what so-and-so said? And it's very frustrating because if you argue against them, you give them more publicity and it's still accepting the framework, even when you challenge it. And if you say, I don't want to engage, then you allow them to set the agenda on the public sphere. So it's like a lose-lose for the public, who I think deserve a more sophisticated approach to these topics. And part of the motivation and the thrill of writing a book is that you get to set the stage anew and say, no, we've been thinking about this all wrong forget about what these guys are saying. This is what's actually happening, and it's not new, and there's a very long pattern, and we should have learned these lessons long time ago. So that was one motivation.
What would you say? I think one of the things you speak about in the book is this old world of prediction of astrologers and religious figures is actually more similar than people would think to the new world of prediction of AI and say prediction markets. I'm curious if you can talk about what the parallels are, but also like what you think is better, what you think is worse, what you think could be improved with the new world of prediction.
The parallels are many. When you look at the history of leaders, you tend to see a prophet next to them. And long time ago, it was the Oracle of Delphi and different seers. Then it was astrologers, then it was social scientists, then briefly economists, and now you see data analysts and tech executives and computer scientists. And one of the things that comes up is how, even though it would be technically incorrect to call something like astrology science, if you had interviewed a medieval European instead of me and asked them about astrology, they would have said something like, well, it's a very technical discipline, it's very hard to get it right, it's very opaque, and it's our cutting-edge decision-making process. And I think we say something pretty similar about AI today. And something that's very important to bear in mind, and I think I want to write more about this in the future in the form of an academic paper, is how AI is a tool. And of course it can be used for the purposes of science within a scientific structure, which is largely social structure. But it can be used in all kinds of inappropriate ways that have nothing to do with science. And one of the ways I think the new world of prediction is both better and worse is this connection to the authority of science. It's better because in some case it is scientific and it is being used appropriately, like for example, predicting the weather or predicting how molecules might interact with one another in the context of a scientific lab, which then validates those hypotheses and goes through a process of randomized control trials and peer review, etc. But it's worse because tinged with this veneer of authority, AI is passing as science practices that are not scientific at all. For example, when we use them to decide who gets hired or who goes to jail, or other questions around fairness. And that makes AI incredibly dangerous.
Would you say that, like, at a surface level, if you think about the accuracy of these predictions and forecasts, you would think that with more data and with better methods, at least the accuracy would be better, even if there are people in power that could use it and abuse it. And so if you take something like prediction markets, let's say, and there's a score called the Brier score that measures, hey, if the prediction market says something is 70% likely to happen over time, is it actually 70% likely to happen? And it's seen to be pretty accurate in that way. Of course, these markets can be manipulated and there's lots of issues with it. But I'm curious if you can comment on that, on the accuracy of some of these forecasts and what you see as not improving from the ancient world of forecasting.
That's a great question. And one thing to note is that even the question presupposes this association between prediction and knowledge. So the presumption is that if the prediction is accurate, then surely it's better. But one thing to note is that there are many ways to make a prediction accurate. One way is this assumption that the future is kind of a script that's already been written and that our job is to figure out what the script is, to discover it, to get a glimpse of it, but it's already out there and written. But when you look at predictions from a historical point of view, you realize that first, sometimes predictions have been made true after the fact. So, once the Caesar is Caesar, then you predict that he would always become Caesar. And so that's an easy way to make a prediction come true. But the other way is through different forms of authoritarianism. So if I really want to know where somebody's going to be tomorrow, the best way to ensure my prediction is accurate is to jail them, because then I can be pretty sure that they're going to be exactly where I think they're going to be tomorrow. And often that's exactly what the pattern we're seeing with AI. So AI predicts that somebody's going to be unemployable, and of course nobody gives them a job, and then they claim accuracy for themselves. So the first thing to note is that we shouldn't assume that because something is accurate is better. It might be a symptom of authoritarianism rather of any kind of scientific precision. But let's go to prediction markets, because those are very interesting. And I could talk for the whole hour on prediction markets. But regarding the current question, it's tricky because prediction markets, because they're open to manipulation, it might be somewhat irrelevant, how well they track certain kinds of predictions throughout time. Because you might have a year or 2 years or however much you want of more or less stable predictions that more or less get it right or better than the experts or better than the alternatives. But then all of that data will make you more confident in prediction markets. And that's dangerous, because then when the opportunity is really important, then someone can come in, and if they have enough billions, they will use their billions to manipulate the situation. And if it's an important enough situation, all of those years of a bit more accurate predictions might be worthless, And let me give you an example. It might be that somebody incredibly rich might become very rich out of a war and might catalyze the war, either because they can access insider trading or because they can influence public perception. And they might even catalyze a kind of spiral escalation, because once everybody starts believing that war will happen, they start preparing themselves, and then the opposing country interprets that as a threat, and then they prepare themselves, and lo and behold, we end up in war. And a war can be a very serious thing when human beings now have nuclear weapons at their disposal. And so even if it's true, which I think is questionable, but even if it's true that prediction markets might gain a little bit of a competitive advantage over other methods of prediction, is it worth the risk that we know exists, because it's already happened, of seriously manipulating explosive situations? I don't think so.
Got it. So the argument is sort of, even if it's true, the fact that it's true, or the public perception is it's true, would lead to people with power, money, influencing prediction markets to their advantage. So let's say the presidential election, maybe you think it's fairly accurate because it's a large market, but at some point, someone like a big whale can come in and influence the outcome, and then you wouldn't have known what the truth was because the public was maybe influenced by the prediction market in the first place. I'm curious, so that can happen with other sources too, right? Like, for example, that happens with news media or gossip or lots of other information sources. And so would you say your argument is generally against, it's almost like you really want people to reclaim their agency and not trust, really any sources. And then I think the counter in some ways is just more like the human experience, which is it's really hard to do that. Like, it's really hard to not think about the future, or not look at different sources, whether it's astrology or religion or prediction markets or AI. And I'm curious just how you wrestle with the practical fact that people want to do this, people want to think about the future and find ways to validate what they're thinking.
So the argument is a bit more nuanced than that, because it's not that I would argue, don't think about the future. that is, I think, unwise and impossible, so not very attractive. It's rather how we think about the future. I want people to be reminded that the future is unwritten, that this idea that there's a script to be unveiled is false, and that more often than not, there's a future to be built. And if you're not busy building it, if you're busy asking people what it's going to be, you're giving other people power to build the future that they want for themselves. And so it's a political point. And contrary to not thinking about the future, we should think about the future, but we should think about it in this kind of more agential way of, what do I want the future to look like? And what am I going to do to make it happen, or try to make it happen, or contribute to it being this future and not that one that this guy is forecasting and is really, really dismal. And, he stands to earn a fortune from it. And so it's a bit of a nuance. So when it comes to, for example, business, I think scenario planning is exactly the right way to think about it. You think about the kinds of futures that might be available to us and which one are preferable, and how do we walk away from the ones that are gloomy, and how do we walk towards the ones that we want. The same thing with a focus on preparation rather than prediction. So for example, we know that another pandemic is going to happen. It's just bound to happen. We don't know if it's going to be in 5 years or in 90 years. But if we want to prepare for it, we would do very well in building in ways that increase ventilation in buildings. And astonishingly, we're not doing that. So it's a kind of different way to think about the future. It's not that we shouldn't think about the future.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that because I was going to ask about the preparation. I thought that was an interesting distinction of how you were proposing to think about the future in terms of preparation. And for those of you that haven't read the book, please do. Because there's a really fascinating set of examples you raised in terms of the history of insurance and history of statistics. And so we get Bayes, we get all of these different ways that people have tried to figure out what's your best attitude toward the future. And so I wanted to kind of ask on the social side, including preparation, how do we, on an individual level, I could say, yes, I agree with all of that. But on a social level, I wanted to get your thoughts because I just read Nate Silver's book On the Edge, where he talks about the river people versus the village people, and that the river people are almost a whole separate, identity, that they look at things in terms of utility, expected utility. And you do talk about effective altruism, but there's a social feature. It's not just a set of individual relations. There's a real social bonding almost. So do you have, in the book, you do talk about this, solidarity and things like that, but how do we get traction, I guess, socially for preparation over this kind of addicted prediction pattern?
So the book is kind of my best shot. And one way is to kind of point out what these people are doing and look what they're doing. This is marketing. And it's a kind of building up of our immune system in a way. When we listen to a prediction and we just accept it as a fact, what we're doing is obeying in advance, even before the order is issued. It's a kind of implicit order that we're obeying. But once you have this lens that alerts you to oh, that's a prediction, that's not a fact. Immediately you react in a different way. And it doesn't matter how famous the person is or whether they have a Nobel Prize or not, because it's irrelevant. Predictions are never facts, no matter who says them. And I think it's also a matter. So one way to put it is that I worry that the kind of culture and narrative that has been peddled by big tech is one that is more appropriate for subjects of authoritarian regimes. So we've become so passive in a way, so much following whatever we are told. And I think that in the context of democracy is not only about voting, it's not only about being informed, it's a kind of attitude of this is my society, this is my country, and I'm an active participant, and you don't get to tell me what to do as if I were a subject, because I'm no one's subject. And part of what I want to instill in people is a kind of defiance and irreverence. And one way is through humor. I think one of the marks of a society sliding into authoritarianism is a loss of a sense of humor, as Milan Kundera very pointedly warned us in his novel, The Joke. And I think we're seeing a little bit of this. And part of what I think we're getting wrong when we listen to the prophecies of these new prophets is that we're taking them too seriously. It's not that we should allow them to do whatever they want. We should be very careful. But when they say outrageous things, we should use comedy to take them with a pinch of salt. Because when we take them seriously, we do our part in contributing to the self-fulfilling prophecy. It's only when we believe them that their prophecies have power.
What would you say is the role of markets in predictions? I thought you had the insurance example was a good one. I think you also gave an example of companies giving out loans and using forecasts or predictions of the likelihood to repay. And I guess I was curious that if they're wrong about that, you would think that they're searching for the truth, and it's not about, right? Like that's what I would think, because if they're wrong about it, then they will lose money because there's another company that will provide a loan to that potential customer. So I'm curious what is actually going on, because if you argue that they actually they're making these inaccurate forecasts. But what's the maybe underlying mechanism through which that happens and maybe continues to happen?
I guess it's a different formulation of your previous question in a way, because again, it's assuming that it's a matter about accuracy, and it's not exactly that they're getting it wrong. It's that they're getting it right, but at the price of partly creating the reality that they're purporting to predict. So yes, they are predicting that somebody's going to be in financial trouble, not giving them a loan. Yes, they will be in financial trouble. So they're not getting it wrong. They are not in a quest for truth, because the most accurate response and the highest profit margin are not necessarily aligned. So you can make a lot of money by getting it right enough. And that's good enough for a bank or an insurance company that's only worried about profit. If you worry about justice, or if you regulate companies to put limits regarding vital opportunities that have to do with fairness, then there's a problem. But if you're only worried about profit, you can get away with getting it right enough, or creating realities. That's good enough. So one of the reasons why statistics didn't work very well in its infancy, and then worked better and better as time went by, is because it boxed people into the categories it described. And of course, then the numbers work better. So one of the examples I give is in 18th century France, jobs were quite malleable. So you could be a carpenter and a farmer and a bit of a doctor. But then statistics kicks in and it starts giving advantages to certain categories, certain subsidies, and if you don't fit the category, then you don't get the advantage. And soon enough, the carpenter ends up being only a carpenter because that's more advantageous. And then the numbers work a lot better. So it's not that they get it wrong, it's at what price are they getting it right? But it's interesting how, you ask, like, what is the role of markets here? Because markets are a lot of things, right? The insurance market is very different from the car market, and I do think that markets play a very important role. And for example, in the history of humanity, banks played a very important role in bringing social stability and in giving authority to governments and in enabling trade. And they were in a sense kind of guarantors of trust. And I think that the more businesses rely on prediction, and in particular algorithmic prediction, because everybody's using more or less the same algorithm, the more they are inserting instability into the system. And not just any kind of instability, but like this kind of monstrous instability in which it might seem that we're minimizing risk in the short term by, for example, denying insurance to a whole lot of people who are riskier. And then, in the first 10 years, the insurance company might do much better. But eventually that risk is going to end up breaking the shoulders of those individuals. And at the end of the day, all of society depends on the stability of the society itself. And so eventually it's going to come crashing down.
Yep. I thought towards the end of the book, you laid out three questions that I thought were really good. One is, when is it appropriate to make predictions? Who is entitled to make which predictions, and what are the ethical uses of predictions? And you asked the reader to think about it. I was curious about your thoughts on this. We'd start with the first one. Like, when is it appropriate to make predictions, and what kinds of predictions maybe should we be more accepting or trusting of, and how you would think about that?
So I partly don't answer them because, I want to inspire a public debate. I think these are answers that we should come up with together. But partly because I also don't want to give the impression that there's going to be a very simple checklist. And if you just kind of go through the checklist, then it'll be fine. Because, I argue against this kind of mentality of the utilitarian, that everything can be reduced to a kind of simple list. It doesn't work that way. But some pointers is I think that making predictions is appropriate when the alternative is worse. And it's often not worse. It's often, better to say, for example, prepare instead of predict. But in some cases, like the weather, it's quite useful to predict. And I think the safest predictions are ones that have to do with things and not people, for the very simple reason that when I make a prediction about a thing, it doesn't tend to affect the thing at all. So whether it's molecules or the weather or whatever else, they don't care about my prediction. But if I make a prediction about human beings, I alter people's expectations, including their own expectations about themselves. And therefore I have an effect on that which I'm predicting. So those are two kind of broad pointers.
Um, I'd love to pick up on that from a very different end of religion. Coming from a religious studies background, I loved the amount of detail you gave to the Oracle of Delphi, your description of what it was like to consult the Oracle was beautifully written and vivid. The one thing, I mean, your examples, they're numerous from the classical world. The one thing I wanted to put forward as I was kind of thinking of the answer to that question is in the Hebrew Bible, and it's partially a linguistic issue of the word prophet, in English having these different historical roots. But in the Hebrew Bible, prophets are not just doomsayers, and they're yes, they're in danger as you put out, as you point out when it comes to crossing authority, but they're also giving voice to some voices from below in terms of who's being excluded in society, who's being forgotten, who might in the end come out on top. And of course, the Christian tradition picks up on this in various ways. We now have a 43,000 word document dropped yesterday that AI ethicists are going to have to read, which I'm good with them. But I wanted to talk about that kind of oppositional sense of prophecy that is more about liberation. I'm thinking of Cornel West's book, Prophetic Fragments, where he's like literally trying to take the prophetic tradition. What would you say? How would you couch that, or where do you find yourself there? Is that a bit overblown and romanticizing of the philosopher's role, or where would you find yourself there?
Yeah, I think it's a bit romanticizing. In my study of prophets, the it's much more common to find prophets that are trying to peddle an agenda for themselves, or for the elite, or for some kind of ideology. But like anything, a prediction is a tool. And so a tool, even though it tends to be used in one way, can be used in another. And so one example I give is when you tell your students that they're brilliant and, don't worry, you're going to be fine in your exam, it's a kind of prediction that is meant to encourage them. And there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, you can cash it out in different ways, just saying like, you're brilliant without making the prediction, and you can encourage them without making the prediction. But the point is that we can use prophecies in good ways. But I think a more honest way is to do something like scenario planning. Like instead of telling people, look, this is a future and it's inevitable. It's like, wouldn't it be amazing to build this future together? Do you want to come with me and build it? And that's a kind of much more honest approach that empowers people. Because one of the marks of the grand prophecies is that they tend to be cashed out as something inevitable. It's just like, this is going to happen and you better prepare. And that is a very disempowering way of manipulating people's perception, it seems to me.
What do you think? I think with these doomsday type predictions, like climate change or the ozone layer depletion or even pandemics, it seems like to do the preparation, to rally the troops to get the preparation done, you actually do need to lay out this like doomsday prediction, because people don't emotionally maybe react to if you don't give that. What do you think about that? And do you think also these doomsday predictions are paths to power, and in a similar way that the other prophecies are.
Yeah, I do think that these doomsday predictions are vies for power. And I think that the purpose of it is to make AI seem much more powerful than it is, make the producers of AI seem much more powerful than they are, and also instill terror in the population, because the more afraid we are, the more we're likely to go to a prophet and say, tell me what to do. And yes, have this power and save me from this thing that curiously you're also producing. And Toni Morrison, who's one of my favorite novelists, wrote of a psychic that his business was dread. And I think that's true. And these kind of doomsday scenarios are exactly designed to induce dread in us. And yeah, I think prophecies are used so widely because they work so well. But that they work well, is that reason enough to use them? I don't know. Pointing at someone with a gun also works quite well. And I hope that we don't use that method. So going back to ancient philosophy, there are two interesting comparisons. One is philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle who decide to react against this culture of both divination and myth and be the voice of reason through mostly arguments. And then you have Plato, and Plato is really interesting for many reasons. But one of the reasons he's interesting is he despises the poets and he despises these myths that make people irrational, but he recognizes how effective they are. And so he creates his own myths. And he tells you what he's doing. He says, like, I'm creating this myth to kind of make the point, and to convince you and to make it tangible and real. And he is effective. And so maybe there's some role for a Plato here that tells us what they're doing, but still comes up with these myths that are sticky and that are compelling in the same way that other myths are.
What do you think the consequences to these bad prophecies or bad prediction people should be? I think you said that in ancient times, the astrologer that didn't give the king the prediction that he wanted would be thrown off a cliff. And we don't do that these days. And so what do you think should happen, or even if it's not legal or violence, even like socially, how do you think we should react to this?
Yeah, that's a very good point, because it's become too easy to make predictions and then it doesn't have any cost. And so that makes it very attractive to do because they work so well and because it engages people. And even when people get it wrong time and again, we kind of forget. And we are so impressed by anyone who gets it right that we forget all the thousands of times they got it wrong. And we forget the very simple statistical point that if you have millions of people making predictions, somebody's going to get it right. It doesn't mean they could actually see the future. Just statistically, out of a fluke, somebody's going to get it right. And so I think socially, we should be much more skeptical of predictions. We shouldn't be asking people for predictions. So another motivation for writing the book is because I wrote this book a while ago called Privacy is Power. And one of the most common questions I get time and again, mostly from journalists, but from the public as well, is what is the future of privacy? As if, because I know something about the present of privacy, I know anything about the future of privacy. And as if it had nothing to do with them, what they're going to do, whether they're going to protect privacy or not. And so that was another motivation. So I think socially, we should discourage people from, not only should we not go asking experts to tell us about the future, we should discourage them when they venture a prediction. And I wish that in newspapers, I would read much more about facts and much less predictions, much fewer predictions.
One phrase that sometimes I just like hearing people expand on a phrase or something to have it unfold some of your thinking. One of the phrases that I was reading that brought me up short was being in the jungle with people, going into the jungle, being ready to go into the jungle with people. And it seems that has something for you of what kind of relationship or how to orient relationships in a way counter to what you're seeing with big tech and how prediction is being offered as kind of a way of being invited in, being invited in. Yeah, go ahead and make your predictions that don't have consequences necessarily, other than perhaps gambling. Can you say more about that phrase, what it means for you, or I just found it striking.
Yeah, so the phrase comes from the biography of Derek Parfit. So Derek Parfit was an Oxford philosopher who is considered one of the inspirations for effective altruism, which is the latest iteration of utilitarianism, which is this very instrumentalist ethical theory that believes that we should maximize utility, which often gets cashed out as well-being or pleasure for the maximum amount of people. In a nutshell. And in that biography, one of his colleagues gets interviewed, and he says that he would never go into the jungle with Derek Parfit because he would be convinced that Parfit would throw him to the jaguar if necessary, justifying it because his work, Derek Parfit's work, was so important that this historian could be eaten by the jaguar, and that struck me as very accurate. And this idea of the jungle is a dangerous place. It's a place where there are no laws. And so the way somebody treats you is just on the basis of their character, because there's no rule of law to make them treat you decently or any kind of social norms or anything. It's just you and that person in the jungle. And it's a kind of test to think about people. Like, would you go into the jungle with this guy who thinks this way and who has this moral theory? And it's a kind of way to have more of a moral compass when we choose not only our leaders and not only the philosophers we admire, but also our friends and the people we surround ourselves with.
Cool, thank you. Liv, do you want to go ahead and ask our question?
Absolutely. Thanks, Thomas. Loved the book. I'm still kind of in the very last part of it. So glad to be here. Thank you so much for coming in to Intellect and sharing with us. So I'm actually very interested in the concept of how metacognition could be possibly one of the antidotes to the phenomena of folks using AI as kind of like AI and oracles as an end-all be-all on prediction. And I feel like you give really great examples of how we're in this flip slide into authoritarianism with how much power we're giving away. And it seems like, at least through some of the examples you offer in your book, about how we can question and be more thoughtful about when we choose to rely on prediction tools, and also through some other research that other folks have done, that metacognition is becoming a core skill in navigating AI, but it requires real self-awareness, literacy skills, especially digital literacy, in an age where literacy and digital literacy are just lower across many populations. I think in the US, especially in where I come from, it's especially low. So I was wondering what you think about how do people who have less than, do they have a real fighting chance with being able to apply metacognition? Because it does seem like academics, like many of us, or people who have more resources, are the ones truly equipped to resist or interrogate AI and oracles for prediction systems as kind of bids for control, if you will, in this doomsday spiral. And I'm asking this because I come from a public health and healthcare background where this is a concern, especially because, like you said, we don't really have strong ethical kind of guardrails around it. So people who are less informed and already at this greater disadvantage are the most likely to be taken in by it.
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you for reading the book. I'm delighted that you're enjoying it. Yeah, I think that you're right, and even though it's a metaphor, and so there are disanalogies, I think about it as kind of strengthening our immune system. And so it's kind of, you could argue that metacognition is a kind of vaccine. It kind of makes you less vulnerable to fall into certain kinds of tricks. And one of the things that encourages me is people emailing me after they're watching the TED Talk or reading the book and saying, now I see predictions everywhere and I had never noticed them. And now, I see kind of the world in a different way. And that was exactly what I was hoping for. And I think even though, I go through a lot of content in the book and there are philosophical aspects, and I try to make it rich because I think prediction is such a rich topic. The main concept is actually quite simple. It's just a prediction is never a fact. Just bear that in mind. And even with that just sentence, you can change how somebody perceives the world and how you affront vies for power. Because, coming as you do from a public setting and public health context, a lot of people will try to get power, promising everything, promising that they will solve medicine, that they will solve all kinds of diseases, and to have those arguments as a kind of, wait a minute, what happened in this case and in this case and in this case, and what evidence are you offering for us to believe that promise is super valuable. And so I guess, yeah, the short of it is, I don't think there's a simple solution, and I think that obviously I'm biased, but I think books are the best antidote to many of the ills that we are facing in the digital age, because it's a kind of technology that is designed to inform you. It's a kind of technology that is designed to strengthen your attention skills instead of slashing your attention span. It's not designed to distract you. And so it's the kind of empowering technology that we need for democracy. And that if we lose, I'm afraid that we might lose some essential pieces of knowledge. And this has happened before in humanity. I was thinking the other day about how we lost the knowledge about bathroom sanitation for hundreds of years. We had it and then we lost it. And if we stop reading, we will lose a lot of knowledge. And so I think that books are part of the solution to many of the problems that we face. But with populations that don't read, I'm hoping that things like this podcast and like TED Talks and just offering these conceptual lenses that can offer a different kind of vision into the world might be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the way you pose philosophy as oppositional and having of itself some of that function is really interesting. How would you respond? I mean, I get a newsletter from one of the folks from Anthropic, and when they talk about, well, I'm reading, I'm having my agents read 200,000 papers that I will be able to have summarized for me and brought to me. There's this rhetoric of accessibility and more and quantity, and so on a visceral level, I think I know where I stand in terms of really appealing to reading and why more is not always better, or what reading involves. What's been your experience? I mean, this book is obviously a huge effort in that regard, but in the last 6 months or so, I guess, when you've been just reading over galleys and thinking of new books you want to write, what do you think about, really getting people to read those books? Not just summarize them.
That is a great question. There's so much I'd like to say here. So first I want to mention, I don't know if you've read this news piece and in the past few days or weeks about AI companies buying thousands and thousands of not very well-known books in Spain in this case, and then scanning them and then destroying them. It's like Fahrenheit 451. It's just crazy.
Mm.
And one obvious remark is that the summary of a book is not the book. So of course you can watch the TED Talk and I can give you the sentence that, predictions are often power plays in disguise. Are you going to get the full message? No, you're not. That's a taste. But part of what it means to be a human being is that we need time with ideas to digest them. We need examples. We need to look at them from different points of view. And we can't do it in 10 seconds. You can't cram the kind of absorption of knowledge and turning it into wisdom that can take years into 10 minutes. I don't care if the system summarizes it. The summary is not the thing itself. And so it's a kind of like, oh, well, I'm not going to go on this walk because I can just look at the map. It's like, okay, I suppose you can say that, but you're totally missing the point. And part of what I would like to convey to young people who are not yet readers is like, there's so much pleasure in it. There's so much pleasure that you're missing out on, and pleasure that you can't get any other way, or at least not any other way I know of. It's a kind of pleasure that is much more active than watching a film, that is much more deep than having a conversation, that is much more surprising. It's a kind of very special realm of ideas. It's very intimate in a very weird way because obviously you're not seeing the author, but you're talking with them in this very personal way. So I wish would talk more about reading, less like eating your vegetables and more like it's this wild adventure and you really don't want to miss out on it.
Mm. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about writing, which is the other activity that teachers are really concerned about, because my thought is that it has those elements and it also honestly has a bit of pain to it that we need to be more upfront about and be able to reframe the way that you just kind of reframed that reading is not just having to make the pain of going through all these pages. Do you have any thoughts about writing that can kind of be a complementary help, since that seems to be, we need other people than, I hope you write many more books, but you also need some other authors out there.
Yeah. So writing, I like to think as a way of enhancing your thinking. So it's not only about the product, but it's also about the process. And when I started writing the book, I had a rough idea of what I wanted to write about and where I wanted to go. But there were all kinds of surprises that you don't get to discover until you start writing the thing. So I didn't expect to write a chapter on effective altruism, but I just realized how well it and how important a piece it was, and how it all depends on prediction. And if you are skeptical about prediction, then the house of cards comes crashing down. I didn't expect to write about speech acts, and it's only through writing that I discovered that connection. And so when we use a large language model to write for us, we're externalizing our thought processes and losing those skills. And that one of the ways I like to interact with tools and things and activities is I ask myself, is this going to empower me? Is this going to enhance my autonomy, or is it going to take it away? And if you engage with large language models all the time instead of doing the work yourself, you're becoming completely dependent and you're eroding your own autonomy. So it's like tying your own hands. And then yes, writing can be painful, but it can be painful in this exquisite way. Like it's painful to climb a mountain. And admittedly, I hate climbing, but I kind of understand why people do it, even though it's excruciatingly painful. Or it's the pain of exercise, or the pain of doing a PhD or whatever else. There is pain in growing, but when you read, you grow. And when you write, you grow. And there's also incredible pleasure. It's like it reminds me of those videos of animals or children cracking a puzzle, and then that kind of joy, that kind of euphoria of like, oh my God, I cracked it. I know what I think about this topic now, or I got the sentence just right. This is exactly what I wanted to express. So I think the hardship and pain is intimately related to the joy. You wouldn't get joy without it being hard.
Mm. We have a question in the chat, and Dennis, you were not required to read the book yet, but we strongly encourage it this point. But Dennis, you're asking if I get you correct that you think there's an important distinction between predicting about objects versus predicting about people, and also that want to ask about virtue ethics as well. That are you in fact kind of Aristotelian, I guess, in thinking about these virtues of living against the forces of prediction? Dennis, feel free to jump in and if I'm not capturing it.
Thank you so much, Carissa. I love listening to you talk and then thinking, because like reading, thinking is pretty fun too. So I'm mostly interested in your normative take, which you kind of answered a little bit about differentiating between objects and people and using LLM to make predictions about one versus the other, and one was maybe okay and one was maybe not so okay. I mean, my obvious solution is, well, I'm just going to go whatever Carissa would do, I would do. So I'm going to do that. So that's my virtue ethics out, I think. But I am interested in you saying maybe a little bit more about that, especially since I started thinking about how whenever you're interacting with objects, you're probably pushing some kind of human engagement down the line, right? So money is an object like atoms, but it has a particular effect. And then I even started worrying that maybe predicting the weather was going to have problems also. So I'm just kind of curious where, and you could just go, no, Dennis, just read the book. That's a really good answer.
I'll say both. Read the book, please. But one reason why in the book, even though I do bring up this distinction, I don't make it so central is because exactly the reasons that you're giving. Because even when it comes to objects, we are so good at vying for power that we can make it into a power play, right? So if I say like, a meteorite is going to hit the earth and I make everybody panic and it's false. It's a prediction about an object, but that has such implication for human beings that I can create panic. And you can do that with the weather just as easily. So it's not an easy distinction that will just solve all our ethical problems. But in general, when we make predictions about things, given that the things are not affected by it, that's just one level less of complexity. Because even though it invites for human behavior in some ways, it's a little bit less reflexive than when you make a prediction about people, because then you have both levels interacting with one another and it's kind of more prone to becoming mayhem. But it's not like, a prediction about a thing is just like fair game and there's no more to say about it. And that's partly what makes the topic so interesting, that there isn't a checklist. There are considerations. And the basic consideration is, given that predictions have implications for human behavior and power, how is this prediction going to influence the world? And is it justified? And where does it come from? And how sure are we? And is it that we're truly engaging in a quest for knowledge? And if so, why? And so it's about asking the right questions more than a checklist about what's okay and then what's not okay, because it's not that easy. And even when it comes to human beings, so for example, what about predictions about genes? So genes are kind of molecules, they're kind of closer to a molecule but genes interact with behavior in ways that, sometimes you can carry a gene and it not get activated because of the context or your behavior. And so it gets really tricky. So it's a kind of rough guidance. Another rough guidance is the more the prediction is individualized, the trickier it gets, because the more easy it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's one thing to predict that, X amount of people will have a car crash in a population of 1 million, than to say this person will crash, or this person will have diabetes, or will, whatever else. That is trickier and usually more murky when it comes to issues of justice. And then regarding virtue ethics, yes, I think I'm a virtue ethicist, but I also think that deontology is very useful. So I think a combination of both is a much better approach to ethics than utilitarianism. And in particular, when it comes to human rights, I think it's important to uphold certain red lines, and we're not doing a very good job, and we're giving AI exceptions that it doesn't deserve.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're coming up to the end of the hour, and so I just wanted to mark that just in case there are any questions uh, that you do want to raise before the end, and to give you all a few seconds to think about those. Chris, I wonder if you could give us a sense. I know from Blue Sky and some other ways that you've been talking already to a lot of people, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do so with us. Has there been any reaction so far that has really stood out to you as something that, oh, this is when I was writing it, I was anticipating this or that objection, and this is a different angle or something that has stuck with me in some way so far?
I think that I adapt my comments in reaction to the kinds of responses I'm getting. And one of the things I'm getting, and given that response, makes me want to write more about it, is this misunderstanding that between technology and science, this assumption that because AI is a kind of technological advancement, then it's scientific and you don't argue against science, and anything critical is kind of against science. And it's like, no, it's the other way around. This is a tool that is being used in very unscientific ways and gets branded as science when in fact it's not. And one of the interesting phenomenons that we're seeing, and very ironic, is that the jury is still out as to whether AI is making science better or worse. It's introducing all kinds of mistakes that wouldn't have been introduced before. And so, for example, a paper in the Lancet in the past week or so showed that fabricated citations have gone all up 12-fold since 2023. And that is a big problem for science. And so the very naive reaction that no, prediction and AI is about science has made me focus more on talking about what is science and what is not, which I didn't expect.
Yeah. I'm going to put a paper in the chat around cognitive surrender, which I found to be a fascinating paper about just how not just are people are not just giving over a certain thinking to systems, but they're unable to reclaim it. When the system begins making errors, they still remain attached, even when you can show them this is wrong. It's still a tool that they can't let go of in a certain sense. So I think your point is, for science, makes a great deal of sense. That the idea of I can consume all the research. Okay, that might be, and I know like GPT-5 plus or whatever is pretty good compared to the previous versions, but there's still this issue of, okay, but maybe you just need to think for a second, and you go for a walk and then come up with something that's a different idea. I want you to have the last word, Carissa, and something that yeah, any valedictory words you have for us. Thank you again for everybody for coming. This has been really thought-provoking, and apropos of the book, a real occasion to come back and read and reread your book.
Thank you so much. I guess, at the end of the book, I come up with 10 heuristics that might be helpful to think differently about the future. And perhaps my favorite is to try to increase your exposure to serendipity. The more we allow algorithms to decide who we meet and what we watch and where we go, the less we are enhancing our agency. And so try to read widely, talk with strangers on the train, and take strolls along the beach, because you never know what the tide might bring. Be open to surprises.
Beautiful. Well, thanks so much again. And we hope here at Interintellect that's exactly what we're trying to do in person and online, to have some of that serendipity and conversations that don't happen elsewhere. That's my little promo, but thank you again so much. Learned so much, and yes, been a great hour.
Thank you so much. Until next time.
Take good care.